I want to talk about the future of transaction processing, the next 30 years of how we're going to process the transactions of everyday life. So every buy or sell, every profit or loss, every paycheck or bonus from the boss, every app we install, every swipe or tap in the mall, every message we send or the money we spend, these are all transactions. So whether you loan or whether you lend, transactions. Whether you build or buy, transactions. Every call you take, every move you make, every ticket for the train, or a seat on the plane, even the tax return you complete having saved every cash receipt. Someone somewhere is sending something to someone somewhere else, and money is changing hands. So what happens when money changes hands? Transactions. So I want to talk about the future of transaction processing, and specifically the infrastructure we'll depend on to do that. The databases we'll need to record how much Andile paid Bongile, and when and for what. In other words, the who, what, when, where, why, how much of every transaction everywhere all the time, and how the world will process this information and store it in the transaction processing databases of the future. Of course, disclaimer, the hard part about the future is that it hasn't happened yet. So we're going to have to predict it. Because if you're running a bank and you're processing transactions, or you founded a fintech and you're processing transactions, you have to understand where these things are going. As Nassim Nicholas Taleb once said, prediction, not narration, is the real test of our understanding. So how can we predict the future to see what our transaction databases will at least look like? The minimum requirements. Alan Kay, the jazz guitarist, computer scientist, and inventor of the Windows interface, said that the best way to predict the future is to invent it. Which begs the question, well, how do we invent the future? To which that greater inventor, Thomas Edison, would reply, find out what the world needs. And here, when we look around at what the world needs, we discover that the world is becoming more transactional. So, for example, our energy sources are changing from coal to clean energy. As you move to solar, you see that the sun rises and sets, and the price of energy changes. So it's cheaper when the sun is hot, maybe more expensive at night. So if your smart meter can transact energy every half an hour instead of once a month, it's literally valuable. You can actually arbitrage solar prices, which is just another way of saying supply and demand are now meeting more frequently, more efficiently. But if you want to do this, if you want to be clean, your infrastructure needs to handle 1,000 times more load as you switch from monthly pricing of energy to half-hourly pricing. So you see the same increase in the cloud. Our computing is changing. As we move from dedicated servers and monthly billing to serverless and per-second billing, you used to buy a server and then rent a server by the month, then by the minute, and now it's by the second, but who's counting? So we've looked at energy and computing, but if we turn to fintech, one of the most surprising things for me is not that the number of fintech startups doubled in the last 5 years. So they did, from 12,000 fintech startups to 29,000 in 5 years. But the surprising thing for me is that, according to Price Waterhouse, the driving force behind this doubling was the growth in transactions around the world. The world is becoming more transactional. New businesses are sprouting up all over, and new foundations and new movements. And when we zoom in on this, we look to India, we see that the world is only going to get more transactional. So, for example, 7 years ago, India's instant payment system, UPI, processed 4 million transactions a month in 2017. 2 years later, that number had not doubled, it had not quadrupled, it hadn't even 10x'd. It was up more than 100x, or 600 million transactions a month, 2 years later, year of 2019. So I almost don't want to tell you what India is doing today, because having 100x'd in 2 years, India then 100x'd again, going from 600 million transactions a month to 12 billion transactions a month, and these volumes are going to triple again. So that's not a typo. It's some serious transaction processing going on. And this is spreading. This is a wave. As we're seeing, this is moving to Mexico. It's moving to Africa. There's 29 instant payment systems, Costa, if I recall correctly from your slides this morning, on the continent of Africa. And there's more continents in the world than only Africa. You know, Africa is not the only continent. And so this is a wave that is spreading. The volumes are going to go through the roof. And the problem is there's almost no transaction database in the world that can handle a 10,000 times increase in load like that. So even if we ignore an autonomous future, let's ignore a future of AI. Everybody's talking about it. So let's ignore that. Let's ignore all the autonomous AI agents. They're going to multiply all our human interactions and transactions. Even if we ignore a future of AI, the point I want to make is that when you look around at what the world needs, in fact, the volume of transactions across several sectors has already increased 100 to 1,000 times, even 10,000 times in the past 7 years alone. And yet, the three most popular transaction databases today, Postgres, MySQL, SQLite, they are 20 to 30 years old. They were designed, they're phenomenal systems, phenomenal. I grew up with these as a developer. They're phenomenal. But they were designed for a different world and a different scale. There's a saying at Google that for every 10x increase in volume, you need a new design. And yet some of the newer cloud databases even, not open source, but they were designed more than 10 years ago, around 2012. Most of the cloud databases that we have today are actually 12 years old at this point. This was before the world became so much more transactional. So the other problem is that all these databases are used for transaction processing, yes, except they're really general purpose jack of all trade. So they don't actually process financial transactions out of the box. If you look at the Postgres documentation for why Postgres has transactions, they will say the canonical example is for Andile to pay, Bongani. And then they show how to do that with SQL. And it's clear that this is a very low-level primitive. It's not the language of financial transactions out of the box. So, for example, again, these databases, they speak the language of SQL when you talk to them. And SQL is a great database language, so don't get me wrong. It's a great language for building apps. You can do anything with it, including financial transactions. But at heart, SQL is a query language. It was designed, in fact, primarily to get data out of a database for analytics. It's not actually, I think, the best way to get the volume of transactions the world over into a database, which is what transaction processing is all about. So there's also tricky engineering work that you need to do around SQL, thousands of lines of code if you want to write a core engine that your engineers will still need to write and get right. The saying is that you rewrite your ledger 3 times. And that's if you don't want to lose people's money. So if you're a fintech, you want to get up and running fast, you want to build people's clearinghouse, or you want to change the world. No such luck. You have to build all of this infrastructure. Or thankfully, we've got Rafiki now, which is providing this, and Mojaloop, which is providing this. But for many people, they're still reinventing financial transactions over their general purpose database. So you can't get up and running fast. Then when you do get up and running, you find that you can only run so fast. So Costa was wearing flip-flops today. I'm wearing running shoes because I'm not a very fast runner, but these do have good colors. The point, though, is that when you do get up and running, you can only run so fast. As your business grows, your database typically starts to hit the wall at around 1,000 transactions per second. That's sort of the theoretical limit often. 1,000, maybe 2,000 a second, maybe 5,000 a second, cutting corners. That's usually the limit. We call it the 1K club with these general purpose engines. So if you want to keep up, if you want to go beyond 1,000 a second, existing infrastructure starts to become expensive. So it's no longer cost effective. It's hard to even make it work. For example, if you're a digital bank, you might find that 80% of your cloud bill, this is what we hear, 80% of your cloud bill is going to go to your transactions database. The cost is approaching the asymptote because your engineers will have to push it past the limits of what it was designed to do. It makes sense. These optimizations are not only going to distract your engineers, from building reporting, building product, they're also going to make your infrastructure complex and expensive. So it takes time and error to get the system up and running before you find out, as we all do, that it doesn't run very fast or it costs a fortune. And then one day, it all goes down. So the lights go out, the database falls over, and there's no automated mechanism to restore operations. And that's because these databases from 20 to 30 years ago, they often only run on one machine. So they don't have what is called in computer science a consensus protocol. It's not built in. So they don't have the safe mechanism to enable them to run automatically across multiple machines, across multiple data centers. So Google was famous for this. They said, we're going to make a data center the computer. These old databases that we all use in open source, they can't do this. You can't just take 3 data centers and make it look like one database. No, you only have one machine, and if that goes, it goes. And then there's maybe backups, but there's still data loss as you fail over. It's error prone, it's manual, it's 2 a.m. So they're not highly available, not 24/7. And instant payments very much are. But the other problem is they're actually just not highly reliable. So they're pretty reliable. And of course, the principle is that, like Stefan said yesterday, you want end-to-end reliability, yes. But for the databases that store these transactions, ultimately the record of that does need durability. And here, existing 20 to 30-year-old engines are actually not as reliable or durable as they could be. So for example, they're not fault tolerant to hardware failure. Most databases, they will write transactions to disk to keep them durable. The saying is that if you're doing computing, never put something in memory because it might not be there when you wake up. So you don't trust your memory, you write it to disk if you want durability. And then these databases, they assume that the disk never fails. So disks are perfect. However, in the last 10 to 20 years of computing, since these databases were designed, there's been research into how disks fail and what happens, to these databases when the failures inevitably occur. So, of course, when a database that's processing, storing financial transactions is destroyed, it's like losing a bank vault with money inside. It's literally people's money. But even if you're a database vendor and you know of these findings, the research is foundational, so it's hard to retrofit. You have to redesign everything to fix these things properly. So popular transaction databases, 20 to 30 years old, general purpose, not built for purpose. They take time to get up and running to process financial transactions. Then they don't run fast enough or they're expensive. It's a perfect storm. In the last 7 years, like we saw, the world became more transactional. And the research around how to maximize availability 24/7, maximize durability, to get the most out of your hardware for cost efficiency, this research was only published, in fact, in the last 6 years, in 2018. So yet most transaction databases today, they were designed more than 10 years ago. So they missed both boats, the problem of scale and the problem of reliability. So it's like the story of the car manufacturer. They invested in a new combustion engine only to discover that the world had gone electric. So how can we invent the future then to predict it, given what the world needs? So there's a need, I think, and this is prediction number one, for transaction databases of the future to be well researched, because existing 20 to 30-year-old databases, they tried and tested, yes. The irony is the researchers know exactly how they fail and how badly. And we know where new designs can just do better. So we've had decades of research that can go into future designs. Second prediction, transaction databases of the future are going to be transaction databases. So they're going to specialize for that. Just as we had analytics databases specializing for analytics workloads, spinning out of general purpose databases, I think the same is true for transactions. We're going to have, out of the general purpose landscape, we're going to have specialization on the other side with transaction processing. So databases of the future for transactions will specialize. They're going to specialize for that. They're going to speak debit, credit. You know, the language of business around the world is double entry accounting. They're not going to speak COBOL. So you don't want, your engineers to have to spend time on reinventing double entry accounting over general purpose databases to make them speak debit credit. Next generation wants financial consistency, financial acid out of the box. They want to get in and drive and get to market. If you have an important project, you need these things very quickly. And the longer we wait, if we wait a year, we wait 2 years, time compounds. It's so important that we get these things to people as quickly as we can to serve the market. So we need to drive 1,000 times faster. The world is becoming more transactional, and that's at a minimum. These are the minimum requirements. We already have a problem. So in other words, prediction number 3 then is we're going to expect to move from designs targeting 1,000 transactions a second, 1,000 debit credits, to 1 million debit credit transactions per second in future. How are our systems going to adapt to deliver this kind of performance? So I think the answer again, specialization, lean, mean machine, pure performance. Performance is often what you don't do, the restraint, the simplicity. If you have Formula One performance like this, prediction number 4 then is that you can trade performance for cost efficiency. So that's why performance is so important, even if you don't have scale, because you can always trade performance for cost efficiency, cheaper payments. So you can replace 200 database machines with 6. You can simplify your infrastructure, and you can begin to serve, I think this is the most exciting part, you can begin to serve new use cases that weren't possible before, like Interledger, packetization, that you just couldn't serve before. Now we can do this. So I think humans are pretty good at swimming, but dolphins are specialized. They make it look effortless, fun. There's new kinds of swimming you can do through the water, in the air. It's beautiful. This is the beauty of specialization. Hard things become easy. So I think, if we're saying packetization is hard, it actually isn't. We just need new transaction infrastructure to power that. And then it's easy, just like the rest of the internet today is easy. If your system is that much faster, that much cheaper to operate, you can do things that before felt impossible. So for example, regulators have recognized the systemic risks of banks running only on a single cloud provider. If all the banks, say in Switzerland, were to do that, then a single AWS outage could halt the economy. This is becoming a systemic risk. So there's a saying, if you want to hedge against the risk that your entire cloud account might be accidentally deleted by your cloud provider, it actually has happened. You have 2 options. So you can either walk into Lloyd's and buy some mega cat insurance, or you start running your transaction across multiple cloud providers, fault tolerance. But today that's not easy because the performance can't keep up. So this is prediction number 5. What if, transaction performance was so excessively good that we can just run multi-cloud all the time, 24/7 by default without thinking? So we make the cloud providers the commodity they were supposed to be. And this is also moving, the category of disaster recovery and just making it the default. We always run multi-cloud. Why must we fail over to another cloud? We should just always be running multi-cloud by default. With performance, you can do that. Penultimate prediction, we're coming into land. Prediction number 6, one more to go, but prediction number 6 is that transaction databases of the future, because they're going to process more volume, they're going to need to be that much more mission critical. Actually, it's not good enough to be as safe as databases of the past. We need to be at least 10 times safer. There's so much we can bring in. The safety standards that are going to be used in designing these systems, they're going to need to be space grade, literally, for tight tolerances, not only 1,000 times faster, 10 times safer. So perhaps these predictions, in the light of these needs, seem obvious. Nobody wants slower, buggier transaction processing. Future's getting faster, better, safer. How can we bring this future forward? And I love this quote by William Gibson. He said that, in fact, future's already here, just not evenly distributed. So people are already thinking about these things. At least this was our experience and delight, not only consulting on the Mojaloop Central Bank Switch 2020, also being part of the Interledger effort. So we had these needs. We asked ourselves the question, how can we stand on the shoulders of giants, take some of the great transaction processing research of the last 10, 12 years, example from MIT, University of Wisconsin-Madison, terrific research coming out of these places in the last 20 years. And also from the high-frequency trading world, as recently as 2020, phenomenal new designs. How can we take all of this and blend this into a new design for the future? So we went and did this to invent the future, at least as we saw it, by developing a financial transactions database called TigerBeetle, redesigned the whole database, rewrote every line of code from the ground up. We found that if you streamline and specialize, you can optimize. So you can break past the 1,000 transactions a second speed barrier, just break right through it, start to go from 100,000 a second to 1 million transactions a second. You can trade this performance for cost efficiency. For example, you can spin up a TigerBeetle cluster. We've done this. Send in 100 billion transactions. It's a little bit more than India's monthly volume. Just send in 100 billion, process these in 10 days on your laptop, hardware that costs $300, for that time period. If you can have this kind of performance, things like running multi-cloud, again, they move from the category of disaster recovery, from something you do sometimes when you absolutely have to, they become routine, your default expectations. So above all, we focused on fault tolerance. We enforced NASA's Power of 10 rules for safety critical code. The idea is you want to give the operator a guarantee that the system is either running correctly or it shuts down safely. And there's more than 6,000 little safety tripwires in TigerBeetle to detect. There's code also to detect when the system's not operating correctly, which is quite unusual to see this in software. Not only the positive business logic, but the negative space of what you don't expect and being able to shut down more than 6,000 of these safety checks in TigerBeetle. So next, it's one thing for a distributed database to make real-time backups. Hardly any systems ever have the database testing those backups. So TigerBeetle is constantly testing the multi-cloud real-time backups it's making, and it's also automatically repairing them. Anything of disk corruption comes in, something gets tampered with, TigerBeetle detects it, repairs it. So on top of this, we used a new testing technique to run TigerBeetle in the equivalent of a flight simulator. So this will simulate millions upon millions of rare failure scenarios 24/7 and test that they are all handled perfectly. Network faults, process faults, machines crash, disks corrupt, clocks get out of sync. This simulator simulates all of this. We've invested in 1,000 CPU cores dedicated. They run 24/7 with these simulators, They speed up time by a factor of 700x in the simulated world, like interstellar. You go faster on some planets than others. In the simulated world, 700 times faster, roughly, running these simulated worlds across 1,000 dedicated CPU cores. Every second, close to 1 million seconds of simulated test time. Every day is close to 2 millennia. This is just, it's so much easier, actually, because you've just got new techniques. It's all in the research. We can stand on the shoulders of giants who've done this before. It's nothing special, actually, but it's so, so different from how databases of the past were designed, built, and tested. This is testing, it's like autonomous testing. Finally, though, this is what I'm most excited about. This is the ultimate prediction, I think, of where the future of transaction processing is going. So prediction number 7, can anybody guess what it is? Prediction number 7, it's going to be open source. Whether it's TigerBeetle or whatever it is, I think it has to be open source. This is what we've done with TigerBeetle. We left the copyright, of a lot of the contracting work on this. We just left it when the company was created, so that we have a very strong incentive. We actually can't relicense. We don't make people sign CLAs or anything like that, because open source we see as orthogonal, to the business that makes the open source sustainable. This kind of technology, we believe, is simply too valuable. It's too valuable not to be open source. Especially if it's going to power Interledger and the next 30 years of transaction processing. So thank you all for predicting it with me. Let's cheers to that future.
Questions? Go ahead, Stefan.
Hello. So we heard this morning from Costa about, sorry, maybe it was in the Rafiki demo, I can't remember, but it was about horizontal scaling. So you were talking about performance, you're going from 1,000 to 1 million. Can you talk a little bit about, is it possible to horizontally scale financial transactions? Is that something that's part of your goals? And is there any limit, anything where we hit a hard ceiling in terms of scalability?
Yes. Okay. Great question. This is actually the heart of what makes a transaction database so difficult to build. This is at the heart of why you can't use a general purpose database. The answer is, think of the stock market. 90% of trades, there's a power law. 90% of trades, people are buying NVIDIA. That's one row in the database. You can't take that NVIDIA row and split it across machines horizontally. I mean, you can. You can give up on strict serializability, so you can, break that NVIDIA across. You can then invest in very expensive reconciliation to try and fix up, so you didn't have the transaction processing. You assumed you had to go horizontal. You didn't have, with existing databases, you don't have the performance. So what can we do? We can't go vertical. Can we go horizontal? The problem is NVIDIA can't. That's one row. If you try to split that up, it's very expensive. The second order effects of all the reconciliation that you have to do, it's like a nightmare. The amazing thing is that if you have the performance, you don't need the complexity of 200 machines. You can replace that with a cluster of one TigerBeetle. Let me explain why. So we call this a TigerBeetle, we call this diagonal scaling. And the idea is to realize that computing, there's actually 4 primary colors. Anyone guess what they are? Network, storage, memory, CPU. So if you assume that these 4 resources are coupled and you can scale them all horizontally, I think that's a mistake. That was sort of 10, 15 years ago. What you see today in the architectures in the cloud is called the disaggregation of compute and storage. It's the recognition that compute is still mostly following Moore's law. It's an exponential resource. Storage, on the other hand, is pretty much linear. So is network bandwidth. So these are actually 4 primary colors, and you scale them differently. You don't want to couple them all and paint the same color in one brushstroke. So we call it diagonal scaling. So actually, you want both. You want horizontal scaling of your large data set as it cools. You connect that into object storage like S3. You keep petabytes of data, cold. That's perfect. That's horizontal scaling. And yes, we need that very much as transaction volumes increase. We're going to need to store 10 years worth of transactions at India scale. That's a lot of object storage. That's horizontal for sure. No machine can handle that. But on the other hand, CPUs scale exponentially. And with this problem of contention, everybody buying NVIDIA, this is actually a solved problem in the world of high-frequency trading. There, what they do is they scale the CPU vertically. And that is it really, you can't go faster than these physics. And that's what we do in TigerBeetle. So we do both. We scale vertically for the contention. For example, you might be operating like a modular loop scheme. There are only 4 participants. It's kind of hard to scale horizontally if there are only 4 rows. So this is the hub problem. And really, I think the best way to do it is how they've solved it in HFT already. It's very easy to do 1 million a second, and that's pretty far ahead of India's needs for the next few decades, probably. So you don't need the complexity of coupling all your resources just to scale horizontally. Decouple, disaggregation of compute and storage. Thanks, Stefan. And I'm guessing you understood this because you've seen this all before. Yeah.
Joran, a question for you. First of all, kudos to what you do and your team. Incredible work getting to that scale, and I love the specialization. What about DLT, distributed ledgers? What's your take on that in your team? There is, we just talked about scalability and speed and so on, and DLT is intrinsically limited. So any thoughts on where DLT is going and whether TigerBeetle may be helpful? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Costa. So I think TigerBeetle is very, it's infrastructure, so it could be used in DLT as well as a store of value at each of the nodes in the network. As a company, we think very much what we've seen today so far is this word trust. So I actually think a lot of transaction processing really does come down to trust, and as people can trust a scheme, you can have financial inclusion, because now you don't only have the big players that only trust each other. They start to trust the scheme, and all the small players can also join the scheme, and the scheme will facilitate trust, and you can use cryptography. And so I do think we shouldn't go to the extreme. I think all these technologies are useful, but we shouldn't go to the extreme of eliminating trust, because that is very, very, very expensive. It's very costly to eliminate trust. I think trust will always be part of the fabric of society, and that is, I think, what will enable a large part of inclusion is trust in these protocols, or in these systems, also in the technology, in the cryptography. And I think we need both. What's very interesting also, I think, where I've seen where people are using a centralized database that they trust, it's their internal operations, but they're also copying, like, TigerBeetle actually does, we call it internally, we kind of hash chain the log of all transactions. We have a hash chain inside TigerBeetle. But what you could do is you could take that hash, go and store that in a ledger. And now you have something incredibly powerful, because you're bringing both worlds together. It's not either or, but it's both. You can have a very strong point in time saying, my TigerBeetle cluster at this point, I had this cryptographic state. Store a pointer to that in DLT. And now you can decouple TigerBeetle data plane, DLT for control plane. So many things I think we can still imagine, and love to talk more. Thanks, everyone.